Anthony, I'll hand it over to you to share even more about yourself, the work that you've done, and go ahead and dive on into our topic for today.
Awesome. So first of all, thank you guys for having me to be part of this lecture series you guys are doing. I've had the fortune of being able to engage with Colorado College students on a number of topics, largely within the political realm. But most of those projects have actually been hands-on, where I'm bringing work to or problems to CC and having students work on it. And this is the first time I'm actually kind of doing this in a lecture and question and answer format. So I'm a little anxious kind of getting into it and hoping I give you guys a topic today that you're excited about and is engaging. But my name is Anthony Carlson. I live here in Colorado Springs. I've been here since 2016. And for the past 10 years of my life, I've been working in elections, from federal elections for US President to US Senate and congressional races. So here locally in Colorado Springs, I've helped out on issue-based campaigns for school funding issues, for Tabor-related issues, if those of you are familiar with Colorado tax law. And I'm actually engaged in city council elections right now. I don't know if you guys know, but those of you who live on campus at Colorado College, we have municipal elections coming up on April 6th, where we get to elect the next leaders of our city council. So if you're registered to vote in Colorado Springs, you'll be getting a ballot in the mail in about 10 weeks. But I'm here today to talk about the role of money in politics. I think, a lot of times we look at our elected leaders and we wonder, where did all the funding come from for their election, or where did that money go, or how does money play a role in the decisions that our elected leaders make, and how all that works together. And so today I'm wanting to cover a number of different topics. I want to start off with a brief history of money in politics. And to me, there's a couple different periods to kind of talk about, and we're going to walk all the way through it, from our founding fathers and some of the very first conversations, from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, that they were trying to figure out and wrestle with as they were trying to plan our democracy, through a lot of the legislation and the laws over the next, 150 years that really kind of got us where we're at today. And then, a history of what I think is really our modern campaign finance and where money's at in politics today, which really is from, this will probably come no surprise to you, those of you that are historians, but from President Nixon to today. The second thing that I really want to cover and really get into detail with you guys with is the layers of money in politics. So what does this look like? How does money in politics, what does that look like, and what's its shape at our federal? So with our president, our US Senates, and our congressional races, to our state elections, which is, for our governor, for attorney general, and for our state house and state legislature, and local, because Colorado Springs is a home ruled city. So we actually have our own campaign finance laws here that are completely separate for local candidates than if they were to be running for a statewide office or for a federal campaign. I also want to walk you guys through, well, where does the money go, and how can we track it, and how can we know that we're holding our elected leaders accountable to know that the values they say they represent are also the values that you can tell that they are true to their hearts by where they're collecting money from and who they're allowing to give to their campaigns. And then the last piece of it is the role of money in politics today and those tools for accountability. So just kind of really thinking through the current events and the things that we're seeing take place in the news today. And also giving you guys the actual tools so you guys can actually start tracking this yourself, and being involved and engaged in, whether it's, holding your elected leaders accountable, or being able to advocate for the change that you believe we should see within the role that money plays in politics, and how you can be part of those conversations and those opportunities to create change within our democracy. So, the early days of our democracy were actually the very early beginning pieces of this really debate that I think has been going on since 1787 into the role that money plays in our politics. And so some things that I want to kind of prime this conversation about as we talk about this very first kind of debate over the role of money that in politics is, are we still fighting the same battles today? Who should be eligible to run for office? And are those, are we actually reaching that level of equity and inclusion in who's representing us in our government, whether it's local or federal? And do the barriers still exist today that we see that existed in the early days of our democracy? And so where this really starts off is with a guy named Charles Pinckney, and Benjamin Franklin at our Constitutional Convention in the 1780s. And there were two sides of this early conversation and debate on it. Charles Pinckney was a planter from South Carolina who grew up in a very affluent and wealthy family. His dad was a planter, and his mom's family was a family of gold miners. And so they were folks of affluence and extreme privilege from the state of South Carolina. Pinckney he doesn't look young in this photo, but he was a young and wealthy planter from South Carolina. He served as a brigadier general in the Revolutionary War, and he was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And what Pinckney wanted to bring, and what he wanted our federal government, so our president and our senators and our House of Representatives to have, is the same model that they had in South Carolina. And in South Carolina, if you wanted to be a member of their Senate body, you had to have a minimum of $10,000 of wealth. And if you wanted to be a member of their House, their lower body, you had to have a minimum of $5,000 of personal wealth. And he wanted to take that same system that was based off of your own wealth and personal privilege and apply that to our federal leadership. And what he recommended was that if you're going to be president of our country, or if you wanted to run for president, you had to have at least a minimum of $100,000 of personal wealth, which is worth a little bit over more than $1 million of personal wealth in today's dollars. And if you wanted to serve in our judiciary or in Congress, you had to be worth at least $50,000. Now that might be something that sounds a little bit strange and peculiar today, but back then there was actually a significant support for this on the first round of ideas of it. James Madison, who's another one of our prominent founding fathers, was somebody else who was very excited about this idea and initially supported it. And the reason there was so much support for this was there was fear that if, poor and common men were allowed to be represented in office, that they would overly hold rich people, accountable for taxes and for generating wealth within our country, and it would disproportionately affect the wealthy and the affluential folks within early American society. On the other side of this debate was Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin is actually one of the more interesting founding fathers that I think we have. Because whereas many of the folks who helped architect our democracy were folks of extreme influence and wealth and education, Ben Franklin's education actually ended at 10 years old. He didn't go to college. His parents were folks probably of moderate means. His dad was a candle maker, and I can't recall off the top of my head exactly what his mother did, but his mother was also involved in helping steer and gain the family finances. In his early 20s, he started into the newspaper and journalism business. He founded the Pennsylvania Gazette, the Poor Richard's Almanac, which some of y'all might know still actually exists today. And he was also a prolific inventor. He created things like bifocals for glasses and other things. And because of his life experiences, Ben Franklin was adamant about the idea that the common man shouldn't be debased, the common person shouldn't be debased and should be represented within our government. And he actually invoked, even though he was a deist, he invoked the Bible and rejected the ideas of covetousness and people using their wealth and privilege to be able to ascend to the highest levels of our government. And so upon Ben Franklin bringing this to the Constitutional Convention, all the folks who were represented and aligned in that debate sided with Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin won the day in the late 1780s. And they rejected the ideas of personal wealth being an official, I guess, an institutional boundary for folks to be represented in office. But as we continue, and as I kind of continue through the history of campaign finance laws and money and politics, Franklin won the first fight in our nation over the role of politics and money. But, the question that I have for you guys, and we'll probably explore later on in this conversation, is, are the ideas of Pinckney, even though he lost that debate in the 1780s, is his ideas actually winning the war today? And even though it's not law and it's not adjudicated, are there informal barriers that protect that, because of the role of money in politics, prevents folks of meager wealth or even modest means from being able to serve in our federal government and our national politics? So I want to do a brief history of the role of campaign finance laws in our country. The very first one, and I just think this is amusing, so I wanted to include it. The very first piece of campaign finance laws in our nation actually took place well before the Constitutional Convention of the 1780s. George Washington in 1755 ran for the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was essentially their equivalent of our House of Representatives, and he lost. And so 2 years later, George Washington, when he was running for office, he spent $200 and bought a bunch of booze. So he went and bought some apple cider, some hard cider, and some whiskey. And he had parties and gave it to folks who supported him and essentially applied votes with alcohol. And so immediately upon George Washington winning his first election in 1757 and joining the House of Burgesses, the Virginia House of Burgesses turned around and passed a law that essentially said that if you are somebody who is running for office, that you are prevented from giving voters, money, meat, drinks, entertainment, or provisions in lieu of a vote. So George Washington, our first president of the United States, because of his acts of plying voters with gifts, was actually the reasons of some of the very first and early campaign finance laws within our country. So moving on, I wanted to just touch very briefly on some of the key events and some of the key legislation in the first 100 years or so of our democracy that really led up to some of the first key the key events that really led to what we see as our modern campaign finance. The first one is probably the election of Andrew Jackson and what's called, referred to as mass democracy. And what that means is prior to Andrew Jackson being president, the only folks in our democracy who could actually vote were white men who also were landowners. However, while Andrew Jackson was running for president and shortly early on in his tenure, democracy was expanded so that you didn't have to have the requirement of being a landowner to be able to participate in elections. So men, regardless of their socioeconomic class, were eligible to vote and participate in elections. What Andrew Jackson did that allowed him to win 2 elections was he tapped into this of really kind of being one of the original, I guess you could call, populist candidates in the history of our country, and really tapped into, I think, the plight of the common man. He ran strongly opposing the US Bank, which caused, obviously, the folks who were associated with the US Bank and other people of affluence and means to strongly reject the ideas of Andrew Jackson. And they raised tens of thousands of dollars, which back then was a significant chunk to be able to run for office to oppose Andrew Jackson. And of course, as we all knew, Andrew Jackson won 2 elections and was elected twice, in the face of having all this money raised against him. But this election was kind of a turning point in the way that money interacted with elections in our society. In the earlier days of our presidency, in the earlier days of our government, it was almost a taboo to actively run a campaign in the style that perhaps is more common to what we see today, with people actually out actively seeking an office and creating ads and materials and content that require money. It was a taboo thing until Andrew Jackson essentially kind of commodified it through his appeal to the common voter, but also the resistance that built up within the banking industry and folks of affluence being worried about what his attack on the central bank in the country would have on their ability to maintain their status. And so from Andrew Jackson, within 3 decades of him really running for office and changing the way that folks approach campaigns, Abraham Lincoln, just 30 years later, had amassed thousands of corporations in this country to give to him, who are largely financed by the war production efforts prior to the Civil War. And so you kind of see Andrew Jackson and the assault that was launched against him from corporations and banks that were worried about what he was going to do to their power in this country, leading to just within 3 decades, fundamentally changing the way that campaigns were approached and ran and where money was raised from. The next real big piece of legislation, and what you'll see today as we go through these various pieces of history, is a lot of this legislation was actually a reaction to things that our politicians didn't like because perhaps this money was being raised and it negatively impacted their candidacy or their ability to get done what they wanted to do. It wasn't necessarily an act of honest reform, but just an act of how do they get leverage and more ability to win campaigns. And the next one was the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. And what this did was it essentially made it illegal for government officials to solicit contributions from any civil service workers. And the reason that this is important was prior to the passage of the Pendleton Service Reforms Act. If you were a government worker, if you worked in a federal agency or a state agency, it was almost required of you to give a small portion of your salary every year to the political person who was, representing your particular jurisdiction. And if you didn't, you probably lost your job. And so this act was passed specifically to prevent that ability for folks to feel compelled to give to an elected official simply because they worked in civil service or in government. The next real big piece was the Tillman Act, which was passed in 1907. And the Tillman Act made contributions to federal candidates by corporations and national banks illegal. This became to being because Theodore Roosevelt, when he was running, was accused of accepting campaign donations for corporations. And so this act was designed to kind of prevent that type of accusation or wrongdoing from happening going forward. The challenge with the Tillman Act, though, is that it lacked any key regulatory measures to be able to enforce it. The Federal Elections Commission was not a body or an entity at this time. And without that regulatory body, this was just kind of an empty bill that was more symbolic than it was anything that was truly meaningful. And then you fast forward just a couple of years later, and we have the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, which required, this was the first act in the history of our country that required candidates in the House of Representatives to disclose their campaign finances. So they had to file a quarterly report that showed where their money came from and where it went. The challenge with this bill was the same, though, that we experienced with the Tillman Act, of that, while it was an act that was well-intentioned, without the regulatory body that we have today of the FEC that's designed specifically to monitor elections and election spending, there is really no teeth to enforce this piece of law. So from there, you fast forward to 1939. And the Hatch Act is probably the first of these that we probably have been hearing about and experiencing in the news over the past few years. Today, what the Hatch Act largely does is it prevents individuals from within their role as a government official from being able to campaign or do electioneering activities while in their official duty as that government employee. And so a great example of that would be during the Trump administration. There were several times where his chief of staff or his communications director would go out and they would say something specifically about fundraising for the Trump campaign, or almost campaigning intentionally for him while they were out on official government business. And the Hatch Act in today's world is created to prevent that from happening, from using government resources, government funding, or your microphone as a government official to actively act in a campaigning mode for an elected official. What the Hatch Act did in 1939, though, when it was first introduced, was it forbid the intimidation or bribery of voters and restricted the political campaign activities by federal employees. It prohibited the public use of funds designated for relief or public works for election purposes, and it forbid officials paid with federal funds from promising jobs, promotions, financial assistance, or contracts based off of their support of a candidate in a federal election. So those were the early days of our democracy trying to wrestle with the role of money in our politics and exactly how we did it in a way that prevented corruption, but also, allowed the folks who were, running for office to still be able to raise funds and to run and campaign. Probably one of the key pieces of early legislation that really leads to where we're at today is the Smith-Connolly Act. This is also known as the War Labor Disputes Act. And the interesting thing about the Smith-Connolly Act is it actually wasn't, its primary purpose was not to fix campaign finance or money in politics. It was actually to repress the rights of unions and organized labor during the Second World War. This started after 400,000 workers went on strike, largely in the coal industry and other critical industries, went on strike opposing wage cuts. They had received a $2 an hour per month cut to their wages, and they all went on strike to protest this. And so the government's response was to crack down in extreme measures against organized workers and unions during this time. So the Smith-Connolly Act essentially allowed the federal government to seize and operate industries that were threatened by or under strikes that would interfere with war production. Interestingly, outside of this particular incident with respect to coal miners and other industrial workers, this law was first put into effect in 1947, I want to say it is, when trolley drivers in Philadelphia went on strike because it was ordered that their trolley line should start hiring Black trolley drivers. And so the white workers went on strike. And that was actually the first time this act was put in place. It wasn't for a War Labor Dispute Act, but to actually enforce measures that promoted more diversity and inclusion in the workspace. But one of the key things that this did that relates to campaign finance is it prevented unions from making contributions in federal elections. And prior to this, the way that unions would contribute to elections is they would just take money straight out of the union dues and use those dues to donate to campaigns or candidates. And that made this illegal. And so the response and the solution that unions came to work around this law was they actually created the first political action committee in the history of our country, which was called the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And so instead of union donations going to this PAC, union members on their own volition would contribute their additional funding to it. And so in 1939, an act that was created to undermine the ability of organized labor and unions to operate in a war environment of World War II, out of that arose one of the small things that actually has led to one of the things that's probably people consider to be potentially problematic in politics today, which is the creation of PACs and soft money. And so moving on from there, we get to what I call the modern start of campaign finance, which has everything to do with Richard Nixon, interestingly, the Watergate scandal, and publicly funded elections. So when Richard Nixon ran for office in 1970, one of the first things that he did after being elected was to pass a law that probably ultimately led part of the pieces that led to his demise, which is a 1971 Federal Elections Campaign Act. And essentially what this did was it initiated fundamental changes in campaign finance laws. It required full reporting of campaign contributions and expenditures, and also limited spending on media and advertising. So not only this was a mechanism to track money, where you got it from and where it goes, but it was also a mechanism that limited the amount of money that candidates could spend on things like TV ads or radio ads and whatnot. In addition, this bill provided the legislative framework for PACs that were established by unions and corporations, which allowed unions and corporations to use the funds that they had raised that were in their treasury or in their bank accounts to operate and solicit voluntary contributions for PACs and to be used in federal races. The other cool thing that this election law did was it created it also created the Revenue Act, which allowed citizens, and those of you that have filed taxes probably see this box in every tax return, but allowed citizens to check a box on their tax forms that authorize the federal government to, at the time, keep $1. Today it's $3 for publicly financed presidential elections. This law was put in place in 1971. The first time we had enough funds in the coffers to actually do a publicly financed presidential election was in 1976. However, just a couple of years after this went into effect, something called Watergate happened. And for those of you that are familiar with the Watergate scandal, you know, the primary way and the means that we know about it today is Richard Nixon had a few campaign operatives break into the Watergate Hotel where the DNC was headquartered from and try to steal documents and strategies and information about how they're running their campaigns. Some of the fallout from that, and what they also uncovered from the investigation, is that the Richard campaign was essentially embezzling illegal contributions into his campaign through some fairly complex money movement schemes, and also through bank accounts and whatnot that were set up in places such as Mexico. And so following the Watergate scandal, the government actually cracked down fairly sufficiently, even more, on compliance for campaign finance reporting, and the ways that money is raised and could be spent. And so in 1974, they included some additional amendments to this that essentially created what is now known today as the Federal Elections Commission. And this commission was given jurisdiction and civil enforcement and an authority to write regulations and responsibility for monitoring compliance with the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971. After there was a few court challenges to the Federal Elections Campaign Act. The most notable one removed the limits of spending from candidate campaigns and from PACs. So if you remember in 1971, I had mentioned a couple minutes ago that FICA passed changes that limited the amount of money that can be spent on media, so on TV and radio. That was ruled unconstitutional and a violation of our First Amendment, and was stripped out of the Fair Elections Campaign Act. So from there, you fast forward to what is really, I think, what we could call the modern days of campaign finance. 2002, the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which is probably an act that those of us who are political nerds are fairly familiar with. And this was passed to regulate the use of what is called soft money. And there are two types of money that you typically hear talked about in campaigns. The first of which is hard money. Hard money is money that is directly contributed to a candidate who is running for office, and their campaign spends on behalf of that candidate. Soft money is any other money. So money that's given to a PAC, that is given to a state party or a national party, money that's given to a super PAC, or money that's given to what is also called dark money groups, who don't have to fully report where their money came from, but are still required to do some financial reporting. The McCain-Feingold Act was specifically targeted at trying to regulate the soft money, and was really designed at national parties and political action committees who were raising money for operations such as get out the vote efforts and other organization building activities. But really what they were using that money for wasn't those activities of getting out the vote, but were using them covertly to actually advocate, particularly on behalf of a candidate. And so this piece of law put into effect regulations that limited the spending and the types of spending that soft money organizations could do, but also provide more regulatory compliance over that to ensure that they weren't using money for electioneering purposes, but were using it specifically for get out the vote and organizational building activities. This is actually leading to what I think is one of the most amusing relationships that we've seen in modern politics, because in 2003, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act was challenged in the Supreme Court. And the plaintiffs in that court challenge was none other than Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell, the California Democratic Party, and the National Rifle Association. So fast forwarding today, it's kind of hard to imagine any scenario in which Mitch McConnell and the California Democratic Party are on the same side of a debate. But in 2003, that's where they found themselves. And essentially what they were challenging was that the complaint was that the law was too broad and it limited their First Amendment rights. And I think that's something that we hear as a constant refrain within all the conversations today about campaign finance is, the role of how we regulate money versus, how does the spending of money relate to our First Amendment rights and our ability to speak freely and use our voice in this country. The court upheld the law in McConnell versus the Federal Election Commission. So they actually ruled that the BCRA could still stand. And so it's a law, give me 1 second here. It's a law that was actually upheld at the time. and McConnell and the Democratic Party of California did not win their suit against the FEC. However, you fast forward to 2010, and this is where you really start to see, I think, the crumbling of the progress that folks would consider was made over the last half century with what we all know today as Citizens United. What Citizens United did was it held that independent expenditures by corporations and labor unions were protected by the First Amendment. So this struck down the provisions in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act that banned those types of expenditures by groups to spend money specifically on electioneering, particularly for candidates of their choice or for other issues. A few months later, the decision from Citizens United was applied to a few other cases in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, where judges argued that unlimited independent expenditures would lead to corruption were invalid. So what they essentially argued, the judges ruled in that case, was that somebody's ability to if somebody didn't have the ability to spend as much as they wanted on an election or an issue or a cause, you're actually infringing on their First Amendment right. The further stripping of the regulations around money in politics took on more of a, continued to grow in 2014 with the rules in another Supreme Court case, which is called McCutcheon versus the FEC. And in this case, what it did was it stripped out rules that put limits on the amount of money of an aggregate contribution that individuals could make every year. And so prior to this, there were limits on the amount of dollars that an individual in any campaign year could give to candidates, PACs, expenditure committees, and other organizations. And McCutcheon versus the FEC ruled that these caps were unconstitutional and essentially said that folks could donate the maximum amount to as many candidates and PACs and other organizations as they wanted within any election cycle. So in theory, a candidate could have an unlimited number of PACs that were supporting them, and one individual could max out their total donations to every single one of those PACs and be compliant and within the law. And so that is really a brief history of, I think, what sums up the big points within the history of campaign finance and money in politics in our country, from our founding fathers to the initial elections that kind of drove the changes and the regulations that took place. And so, the question that, I think about as I went through and I prepared this presentation was thinking back to Pinckney and Franklin in that original debate on the floor of our constitutional convention in Philadelphia. Franklin won that original fight, right? He advocated for an approach and a system that provided access for the common man to have a strong voice and the common individual to have a strong voice in our politics. But when you look at the progress that had been made and over the past 50 years has slowly been eroded, the thing that I wonder myself is Pinckney winning today. We might not have the laws that specifically say you have to be a person of particular wealth and influence to run and to serve in our US government or even state and local government, but without even having to legislate it. Are the values that Pinckney stood up for and said we needed in the late 1780s, with having, a minimum that folks needed to be worth to be able to run, are his values actually winning out today, even though it's not particularly legislated? And so those are some of the questions that I really want us to focus on with the second half of this. What does money in politics look like today? I think these are all questions that we can think through of the ways that we've seen candidates either change values or positions, with folks winning elections and wondering, how does a person, with that demeanor or that mindset or those values win? And how much of that is actually influenced by money? How much of that is influenced by the media or our ability to buy the media based off of advertising and social media and all these other avenues that we have to influence folks today? The second question is, do our current regulations and laws give some a bigger voice? This is something, as somebody who actively works in campaigns and politics, both for candidates and issues, I think about a lot. What does this mean with respect to our First Amendment? Is it fair that somebody gets to have a bigger voice in our politics simply because they have a bigger bank account? And if we don't agree with that idea, what can we do to fix it? And the last thing is, what influence have you personally watched money have on our government? I think something, especially with the nature of our politics over the past 4 years, and watching, and it goes beyond the past 4 years, but I think we've really gotten a front row seat to it over the past 4 years of just watching the role that money has, not just money to campaigns and candidates, but knowing that, if you're a politician in this country and you own a business, that, folks might, visit and invest in your business and buy things from you simply because they want your influence in other areas. And so those are the three big questions that I've thought about, and I wanted to share with you guys as we kind of transition this into some of the nuts and bolts about how all this works and fits together, and how we can research and hold our politicians and our government accountable to the influence of money that does currently exist in our politics. So first of all, kind of gravitating into this last piece of the conversation, I just wanted to start off by providing some definitions of things that you've probably heard, or that I've, prior to this conversation, and that we've talked about during this conversation. The first one is something we touched on a few minutes ago, which is the difference between hard and soft money. With hard money being money that's directly contributed to candidates that they spend personally on their behalf through their campaign to help with their particular election. And the other piece of it being soft money that goes to political action committees, super PACs, dark money groups, and other independent expenditures that are spent not in conjunction to support a particular candidate, because they can't collaborate. Candidates cannot collaborate with PACs or super PACs in their elections, but are spent to advocate for particular candidates or issues, but aren't directly contributed to their campaign. The other ways, so that's the type of money. Now, what are the types of entities that money can be given to and can spend money? The first one, and probably the ones that we're most familiar with, is a candidate committee. So a candidate committee is a committee that is formed particularly on behalf of a candidate, where its activities are 100% focused on getting that candidate elected to a particular office. The next kind of entity that we're probably all familiar with is a PAC. And a PAC is a political committee that raises or spends more than $1,000 to influence the outcome of a federal election in a calendar year, and is required to register with the FEC as a result. They may accept contributions up to $5,000 per year from an individual. However, a PAC cannot receive money from unions or corporate treasury funds to be able to fund their operations. A very similar but different type of campaign entity is what's called a super PAC. And we've probably heard about these plenty in political season and during elections, and some folks love them and some folks hate them. And it's really a big debate over the role that super PACs play within our politics. But a super PAC is a political committee that meets the same threshold as a PAC and raises more than $1,000 a year to influence the outcome of a federal election, and is required to register with the FEC. However, a super PAC is what's referred to as an independent expenditure only political committee. And so what differentiates a PAC is that it may accept unlimited contributions from any non-foreign source, including unions and corporate treasury funds. It may spend unlimited amounts to influence the outcome of federal elections through independent expenditures. However, it may not contribute directly to a candidate, and it cannot coordinate with a candidate in making its expenditures. So whereas a PAC can contribute directly to a candidate and support a candidate directly, super PACs are not allowed to do so, but they are allowed to otherwise spend and raise unlimited money from whichever source they want, as long as it's not foreign, influencing the outcome of an election. So while they can't coordinate with a candidate and they can't give a candidate dollars, they can raise unlimited money to support a candidate and to place ads and try to influence the outcome of the election otherwise. The last type of campaign entity is what's called a dark money group. Dark money groups are typically what's called a 501c4 organization, which is referred to as a social welfare group, or a C6 organization, which is a trade association. Chambers of commerce are an example of a trade association. They have a membership that pays dues, and that's where a lot of their sourcing and funding comes from. These are also referred to as issue advocacy groups, and they can accept unlimited contributions from any source and are not required to publicly disclose their donors. And that's where the name from this of being a dark money group comes from, and why so many people get frustrated with dark money groups is you'll have entities like this that raise massive sums of money, and they go and they influence the outcome of an election or support a candidate or an issue. But we can't see where their values are based off of who those dollars are coming from. And you often see conflicts within this space where a new dark money group pops up overnight and starts spending a lot of money. And it sounds like it might be a liberal or conservative organization, but you can tell by the way that they're advertising, for example, that it's really to try to undermine, you know, the outcome of an election or undermine a candidate or an issue. And people get frustrated because they can't see, well, actually, who is funding this and what is actually the source of this and who is behind this influence in our campaign world. And so those are the 4 different campaign entities that we'll typically see, and that are really the most prominent that we deal with and hear about every day when we're talking about campaigns or money in our government. So from there, I wanted to jump into the 3 different levels of federal election campaign finance laws and regulations. You have the federal elections, which is what we're most familiar with, which relate to our presidential elections, our US elections, and our US House elections. And here is a graph that breaks down the type of donor and how much they can give on a yearly basis and who the recipients of those are. And there's some interesting things in here that I wanted to point out, because there's interesting ways that especially our national political parties have leveraged this matrix to be able to maximize the amount of money they can raise every cycle. And one of those mechanisms that they use is what's called bundling. And what that means is any one individual can only give so much money a year to a particular candidate, to a particular PAC, or a particular state, district, and local party, or even the National Democratic Party, for example. However, what somebody can do is they can individually give to every single candidate they want to give to. They can individually give to every state party. They can individually give to the national committee. So one person, although they have limits at each step of the process on how much they can give to any one individual entity, when you sum it all up, you can see here that candidates can give quite a bit of money. You know, there were stories of fundraisers, and you hear about them in every election cycle, where it costs you $250,000 for a plate. And that blows people's minds, because people are like, well, I can only give $2,800 a year if I wanted to. But how are these people giving $250,000 every year? And this matrix spells that out particularly, of how it's very easy for an individual or a PAC or another entity that's allowed to give, to be able to manipulate these laws. So instead of giving the maximum donation that, you know, one individual may be able to give, they're spreading that out over dozens upon dozens of entities to be able to significantly influence the outcomes of elections. The other really interesting thing about this is if you look at the bottom of the matrix, where it says state, district, local party committee, and national party committee, there's unlimited transfers of money that can take place between these entities. And so often what you'll see, especially in a presidential election or a really busy election cycle, is you may give money to one political entity or state party or national party, but they're able to seamlessly transfer that money between entities to maximize the value of that across committees. So you'll see safe states like California, for example, they may take funding and then transfer it to a battleground state, for example, to make sure that you know, Democrats or Republicans, you know, in states that need the funding get it. And so it's a really interesting way that national campaigns are able to manipulate the campaign finance laws to get money into the places that they need them to be able to see success on election day. The next place for campaign finance laws and the next level of it is state elections. And so in this case, I brought up what this looks like in Colorado. In Colorado, state elections apply to the governor, the lieutenant governor. However, the lieutenant governor runs on a joint ticket with the governor. So it's almost like a president/vice president, where the president chooses a running mate. The secretary of state, the attorney general, the board of regents for public institutions of higher learning. So the University of Colorado for example, has a board of regents that are elected to serve and represent the UC system. Our county commission, so El Paso County has 5 county commissions, which is a state entity and is subject to state campaign finance laws. And the last one, interestingly, is school board. Candidates for school board actually have to register with the Colorado Secretary of State and submit their campaign funding and contribution raising and spending to the Secretary of State. So what you can see here is the funding and the contribution limits for state races is actually significantly lower than what you see for federal elections, which is something that I actually am a big fan of personally. I think things like state legislature and the state Senate and state House should be accessible to anybody. And I think these lower contribution limits allow for more common folks to be able to run. And so what you'll see here is really just the biggest difference between the two is there's the limits on campaign finance dollars is lower. However, the other really interesting thing that is different from state to federal is corporations can donate directly to issue committees in Colorado. I've ran a few school funding elections that have taken place during November elections in Colorado, and businesses and corporations have been able to directly give to my campaigns. Whereas if I was running a federal race for somebody who is running for Congress or for the federal or for the Senate, they wouldn't be able to give directly to a candidate. And the last layer of campaign finance, which I find is really interesting, is our local elections here in Colorado Springs. So here in Colorado Springs, we are what's called a home rule municipality, which means in a lot of ways we get to set our own rules and laws when it comes to things such as elections. In Colorado Springs, these elections apply to things such as our mayor, such as our city council, and also other issues that may relate to the city, such as, the raising of taxes or, the issuing of bonds or investment into other entities in the city. And there are actually no limits on contributions from people or from corporations in our local elections. So somebody on this call, during this, if one of us wanted to run for mayor, and somebody else here wanted to give that person $3 million to run for mayor and to support their campaign, there would be nothing that prevents that individual from doing so. And so really, I consider Colorado Springs to almost be the Wild West when it comes to campaign finance. They still have to report. Actually, right now during this election cycle, candidates have to report every 2 weeks. But there's no limits on how much folks can raise or how much they can raise from any one individual. So that leads to the next fun piece of this. And I think honestly for this conversation, these next few slides are probably the most important pieces of this conversation is how do we actually follow the money? How do we know where candidates or issue committees or PACs are raising money from? And also how do we know what they are spending their money on? So there are a few resources that everybody, they're very easy to access or very easy to research, can actually go and follow this fairly easily. From federal elections to state elections to even our local elections, there's compliance reporting that has to be done, and it's all publicly available. So for federal elections, the best place to go is actually the Federal Election Committee's website, fec.gov/data. And from there, you can research particular campaign committees. You can search, if you want to see how your senator or your congressman raised his money, you can search for that. If you want to see how a particular individual gave, which honestly for me is probably the most fun with this, you can actually research contributions by contributor as well. So if you want to see which campaigns your mom or dad are given to, you can actually go plug in their names into this and research it and see what kind of campaigns your parents are given to. The other resource for federal elections is opensecrets.org. One of the things that I like about opensecrets.org is they're a nonprofit that does a really great job reporting on campaign fundraising and spending, not just from the report side, but they also compile data on the trends that we're seeing across the country in campaign spending. So for example, last year during the presidential election, they would occasionally put out reports on how much each presidential candidate was, spending on social media in particular battleground states, or they would announce when candidates made TV buys. So it really kind of gave you a micro level view of the strategies that these candidates were using as they were going through the process of trying to win an election. For state elections, so for tracking things for our governor, for our state house, our state senate, it's a tool called Tracer, and you can find that on the Secretary of State's website through the URL that's listed there on the screen. And it's set up very similarly to the FEC's website, where you can search by issue committee, you can search by candidate committee or the person who's contributing to or from, and be able to see, after every report that's filed, exactly who's giving to those campaigns and how they're spending their money. And the last one, for those of you who are interested in local politics, is the Colorado Springs elections website for following the money in campaigns. Unfortunately, of the four of these sites that I've mentioned, it's the one that's kind of the most restrictive in how you can search. You don't have the ability to search by a particular contributor or donor. You actually have to pull up the entire campaign finance report, download it into a PDF, and look through it. And this is actually one of the issues that I've thought about a lot as my career in politics has unfolded, is how do we build a more standardized system into this so that accountability is shared across the board. And governments in certain municipalities, because of whatever motivation they may have, is inclined to try to not be as transparent with funding and funding sources and the ease of access to information as possible. So what are some of the things that you can actually research across these four different these websites? A is, how much a candidate has received in donations. So you can go and see how much they've raised in total. You can go and see how much a candidate has spent. So you can see how much of those dollars they've raised they spent, and actually even see what they're spending it on. How much a candidate has in cash on hand. So that's really just taking the amount of money they've raised, subtracting away from it the money that they've spent, and that gives you an idea of the cash on hand that they have. Who has given to a candidate. For me, this is something that's always very important, because I believe, it's one thing for a candidate to go out and talk about their values, but if you can tell the folks and the entities that are giving to them maybe don't align with those values, maybe it causes some questions that need to be asked of that individual. Like, hey, you're saying this is a value, but when we look about who's funding your campaign and who's contributing to it, it seems like there's not an alignment between what you're saying and who's supporting you. So, can you talk to us about that? You can see how much somebody has given to a candidate, and you can also see when somebody has given to a candidate. And so those are all very meaningful things that I think to know, especially as we move forward on our democracy from today, of really getting past the values that they talk about, but to the values that they are living through, where they're willing to accept money from and how they're willing to spend it. So I wanted to wrap this up just by talking about a few minutes about how folks can get involved. I think, we're at a place in our democracy in our country today where I think the role that money plays in politics has probably taken on, a greater sense of visibility, and probably has created more of a sense of urgency in fixing than maybe any other time in the history of our country. And so some basic ways that I recommend getting involved is number one, researching the candidates and who they're receiving money from. So using the tools and the resources that were laid out on the last page, and putting that into action, and being able to really kind of dig in and learn where these people stand, not just from the values they talk about, but the values and the people they're willing to take money from. The second one, and this is probably one of the most important of this, is holding your elected officials accountable with your voice and your vote. It's one thing to be frustrated, and disenfranchised and feeling discouraged by how money is being spent and raised. But, the only way we can facilitate the change and get to a place where we feel like we have a democracy that's more participatory and works for more people, is by being actively engaged in it. And the best way to do that is, just simply by picking up the phone or sending an email or going to a town hall, or, hitting up your elected officials on social media. If you don't like the current system, work to change it. And there's several ways that we can start doing that. We can organize and lobby our city council. One of the benefits of Colorado Springs being a home rule city is, while maybe right now our campaign finance laws aren't where we would like them to be, that doesn't mean we can't take up the responsibility of organizing and going and talking to our city councilors and our mayor and asking for those changes. And requesting and pushing for changes in these laws that make it more equitable and create more access for folks to run for city council. That just doesn't require you to have one big donor who wants to support your campaign. The other ones are organizing and lobbying our state legislature, our Secretary of State, and our governor. Well, I think Colorado has done a good job of overall of addressing campaign finance and trying to create as level of a playing field as possible. That doesn't mean there isn't still work that can be done. One of the things that I think about a lot is, while I'm politically aligned and I share the same values as our current governor, Jared Polis, Jared Polis is also an extremely wealthy man who self-funded his entire campaign, which isn't something that all of us have the capacity to do. And so maybe one of the things that Colorado could take up is doing some of the work that other states or other cities such as Portland has done of creating more public finance opportunities within their campaign finance systems where there's public funds that are available, so more folks have the opportunity to run a compelling campaign and to be able to compete for these offices in election. And the last one along the organizing front is also lobbying your senator and your US congressional reps. There's a lot of work that's been done around this and is continuing to try to make its way through Congress that relates to campaign finance and creating a more equitable system at the federal level. But we have to keep up the pressure there. If there's changes that you want to see or ways you think the system can be better, your voice is needed just as importantly there as it is in other places. Interestingly, one of the things that spurred on modern campaign finance back in the early 1970s was after Nixon and Watergate. It had been reported and there's historians that documented and said that after that, 1 out of every 4 letters that came to Congress after Watergate was around campaign finance and the urgency of reform and people being unhappy with the role and the way that money operated within our politics. And it led to a lot of change. And a lot of that change in some various ways has been undermined by our courts and whatnot. But it does show the power of, when people take something seriously enough and organize around it and lobby it, that there can be significant change that is done that fundamentally improves systems. And the last 2 things is to join an organization that's already doing the tough work. Common Cause is probably the #1 organization in the country that's leading campaign finance reform conversations, just not at the federal level, but at the state level and at the local level too. They were actually one of the primary organizations responsible for overhauling the public financing of elections and campaign finance work in Oregon within the last 3 or 4 years. So they're an organization I strongly encourage you to look up and get engaged with if this is a topic you care about a lot. There's also other centers such as the Brennan Center for Justice that is committed to more in the legal space, so fighting for and defending positive changes and outcomes that are related to equity in campaigns and politics, and making sure that the money in politics, the role that money in politics plays is in a more healthy space. And the last one is to just make sure we vote in every election. It's the easiest and the most expedient way that we can create change is making sure that we're supporting elected officials at our local, state, and federal level that share our same values and share our same views when it comes to the role money plays in our politics and in our government, and making sure that they're given the ability to go to Congress or go to our local government and to make the changes that we hope to see. So I know I rattled through this pretty quick. I know I threw a lot out there with respect to the legislative and the legal history of this and walking through the nuts and bolts of how it all works. But I also wanted to leave time at the end for you guys to ask questions or just to really have a conversation about the role that money plays in politics and your feelings about our current system and how we can change it if that's something you're interested in, and just any details you guys want to ask about the role money plays in our politics today and what it might look like going forward. So with that, I'll just open it up for conversation or questions.
Yeah, I have sort of a thought/question. So we've just been talking a lot in this half block course about like the accessibility of kind of information around civic engagement. And like throughout this talk, we've talked about like candidates having to report their donations and things like that, which seems like a really good step for transparency. And also like us now having those sources for having those sources for looking up campaign finances is really great for like us as like educated college students. But like, I guess what other, like, it still seems like a very inaccessible thing for like most people who are voting in elections. So are there more steps or like ways to make this even more transparent and accessible?
I think, that's a good question. And I think, there's states that do and approach campaign finance in different ways. One of the very first states that I actually worked in was the state of Virginia. I worked on what they call the House of Delegates, which is essentially the equivalent of the House of Representatives in most states. And their campaign finance laws actually prohibited dark money groups and political action committees from being able to essentially run soft money campaigns where they're acting on the behalf of candidates. But they did that while allowing those entities to donate directly to candidates. And one of the things that I appreciated about that approach, while I didn't think it was perfect, was then there was no secret in where these folks were receiving their money from, right? Or who was out there supporting them and endorsing them. And it was essentially, to me, of like essentially the same as, being like a NASCAR driver who has all of your sponsors on your shirt, right? And so, I think this will be the challenge, that I think a lot of politics faces going forward, not just within the realm of campaign finance, but how do we get information out in general and folks being able to know that it's factual and accurate and something they can trust. And that's a question I've really wrestled with. I think facts have been challenged in a way that I don't think anybody ever anticipated, and being able to know what to trust and how to trust it. And so, I think that's a question we're all still, I feel like that's a big non-answer. But, I think that's something a lot of us are wrestling with is, how do we create more transparency in where these dollars are coming from and how they're being spent? But while you create that transparency, how do you communicate it in a way that people believe and understand that it's a fact when you do so? I honestly think really what that comes down to is how do you localize politics more and more, right? How do we get politics out of this national sphere where it's, my side versus the other who's, this bad, horrible thing, and making it more about being able to share information among friends and communities and neighborhoods. And that's something that I've been really focusing on post 2020 is how do we get politics down to where hopefully you're rebuilding that trust at a local level, to be able to eventually hopefully gravitate up to a national level. I think it's something that the only way you can build more transparency into that piece of it, of the funds and how they're being spent, is by building trust in where the source of the information and where it's coming from. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of where my head has been at, just really kind of thinking about the state of politics in general for the last 2 months.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, I remember, I think in the 2018 midterms, there was a proposition about like trying to counter kind of like the millionaires loophole, like how you mentioned, like Jared Polis can entirely self-fund his campaign. And it did that by like, I forget the exact specifics, but if you were not a millionaire, it would increase the caps, I think, at which people would be able to donate to your campaign or something along those lines. So like in a world where like Citizens is not going to get overturned anytime soon, and I think this proposition ended up failing. But like, what do you think of like kind of the fighting fire with fire type approach, where like on one hand, like there's getting more money in politics that are not solving the problem, but on the other hand, you're giving less wealthy candidates kind of a little more of a shot?
Yeah, there's been all sorts of different, I think, mechanisms that local and state governments have been trying to take to level the playing field a bit. Portland, I'm trying to remember exactly how Portland's is designed now, but I believe Portland's is designed in such a way now that anybody who gives to gives a financial contribution, actually unlocks public funds that also go and support whichever candidates they want as well. And so that's another interesting approach to fighting this. You know, your question, I think, was really, I think, a philosophical conversation that took place during the Democratic primaries last year. If you remember the conversations about super PACs and, you know, I want to say it was between Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg, what was the debate. And really what it centered around was, you know, we have these ideals, but at the same time, if we don't kind of unload the entire toolbox and use everything we have at our disposal, knowing the other side is, like, we're at a disadvantage, right? And I think the challenge that that creates, I think, is the same challenge that we saw within the legislation that I talked about in the earlier days of our democracy, where a lot of those earlier bills that were passed in our federal government weren't necessarily to fix a problem that they saw as, you know, a big kind of philosophical problem to solve, but they were solving a problem that was preventing them from winning elections, right? Whether it was the other side has more access to bank workers than we do. So now that we have control of Congress, we're going to pass a law that prohibits, you know, federal workers from giving and whatnot. And I think the challenge, and I think the thing we have to hold our elected officials accountable to is, you know, you said on that debate stage, and you said when you were running for office, that you think the way money operates in politics is wrong, and we need to fix it. We need to fix the role of super PACs and unlimited spending. And you also said, but for now, I need to be able to do that so I can win my election, so I can actually fix these things. Well, it's great to say that, but if you're not actually fixing those things when you're elected, that's where we need to start holding these folks accountable, right? If that's a value that you have, is saying, hey, you know, I gave to you and I supported you because you held this value. And then I understood when you said, but I have to win the election, which means I have to use the current laws to their full, you know, to their full extent. But now that you've won, and we got to come back to this value proposition so you don't have to do that again. And I think that's been the missing link is, you know, even when folks who care about this as a value and espouse it, once they have the majorities or whatnot that they need, we really haven't seen, I think, the fundamental change that a lot of folks think about. And I think that's the next steps for us, is figuring out how we close that loop.
Any other final thoughts, comments, or reflections, key takeaways, or questions that folks have for Anthony as we get ready to wrap up? Well, thank you all for joining us today. Anthony, thank you so much. Would like to give Anthony a round of applause. Can use our little emoji option as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Anthony. This was a really interesting topic. You provided so much information for all of us. Definitely a lot to continue to think about, and greatly appreciate wrapping up and talking about ways that we can be getting involved in using our own civic agency to create the change that we want to see in relation to money and politics. Anthony, if you are comfortable sharing your contact information, otherwise, any folks that would be interested in getting in touch with Anthony or the work that he is doing here locally, you can always reach out to myself or Sophia in the CCE. We're happy to help foster getting students and faculty and staff, any folks who are here and want to get connected with the community. We're happy to make those connections. Thank you, Anthony, popping your contact information in the chat there for any folks that are interested. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining. Quick plug that on Monday, we will be doing a community panel as part of MLK Day and this course. Anthony will be joining us again for that panel. We're looking forward to that conversation as well. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us today.